Hello, welcome everybody. It's 6 o'clock and we're here at the end of November for the kind of tail end of our book talk series. Tonight we have not just a speaker, Rick McGahey, but also a discussion that's going to follow Rick's presentation with John Mollenkopf. And I'm going to introduce them in a moment, but as you can see on the screen, the title of this book, Unequal Cities, overcoming anti-urban bias to reduce inequality in the United States, is quite a mouthful, and it's an academic consideration of the urban economics, issues of inequality across cities and within regions and across the country. And tonight, Rick is going to focus mostly on a New York example. Let me introduce Rick McGahey first, who is, I have to say, a good personal friend, as is John Mollenkopf. So a lot of the discussion that you'll hear tonight is the kind of dinner table conversation that we've had over the years. So I know the quick minds and the deep thinking that both Rick and John bring to this subject. And I hope that the discussion tonight will be both basic in the explanation, but also complex in the consideration of the issues. So this book, which I can't hold up for you because it's not going to be released until first we thought December, but now it looks like January, but you will be able to find it through the link on our website. This book is the work of a long time study. Rick is a person who has had experience in government, both on the federal and on the state level. In fact, he has in his past, well, in his present, he's an economist and senior fellow at the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis and the Institute of Race, Power, and Political Economy, both of those at the New School. Before that, in his kind of past lives, he served as the executive director of the Congressional Joint Committee on Joint Economic Committee, the assistant secretary for policy at the U.S. Department of Labor, and in senior governmental positions in New York State and New York City. He was the director of impact assessment and the program officer for economic development at the Ford Foundation for many years. He's also an active blogger on urban economics for Forbes magazine. So in conversation then, after a short kind of recap of the main themes of the book, we'll be joined by John Mollenkopf, who is the Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Sociology and the Director of the Center for Urban Research at the Graduate Center at CUNY. He's the author of many books on this topic of cities and economies, A Phoenix in the Ashes, the rise and fall of the Koch Coalition in New York City politics, the contentious city, the politics of recovery in New York City, and the perennial Place Matters, where he's a co-author. The subtitle of that book is a Metro Politics for the 21st Century. So we have two great experts to speak tonight, and I'm going to slide out of the chair and let Rick come in and begin his presentations.
Thanks, Carol. Welcome, everybody, and thanks to the museum. A wonderful place. If you're watching and haven't been, come see it. Always something to learn here. So Carol gave a good introduction to the book. Let's just jump right into it. I'm an economist, but I'm going to try not to do too much economics except to illustrate some of the ideas. So let's just get started. This is the book. Carol read you the title, Columbia University Press. You can buy it wherever fine books are sold, online right now. And the basic thesis of the book is what it says, that cities are unequal. Cities are the hubs of prosperity and growth, but they remain unequal, both within the cities and the metropolitan areas they're in, as well as between cities across the country. And we're going to explore a little bit of both of those themes. And why is that? Why is there persistent inequality that cities themselves, even when they want to, can't seem to correct? a little bit about what economists get right and wrong about cities, and you can read, I'm not going to read you the slides, you'll see them there. But the second point is probably the key point. Why do cities produce wealth, but also persistent inequality? And why can't they overcome that inequality? Economists view cities, I'm blocking one of the cities here, one of my picks I see with my little screen on top, but that's Triumph of the City by Edward Glaeser. Some of you may have read it, and I've counterposed it with Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. Urban economics for a while was pretty moribund, and these two thinkers really gave it a boost and an attention that has become very important to us now. And they did that by focusing on cities' roles in innovation and growth. Urban economics used to just be about household location. Why do people live near transit sites? Why do they move around from household to household? But Jacobs really, prior to Glaeser, and Jacobs is not a conventional economist, focused on this issue of innovation. That why do cities produce? They bring together all sorts of different factors, and that produces innovation. That sounds kind of abstract. So, but if you think about actually, one of my favorite examples is jazz music in New Orleans, right? That you get brass bands from German music and John Philip Sousa music. You get freed slaves who brought their own kind of rhythms and instruments in. You get music from the Caribbean. You mix all that up and you get jazz because you brought in different types of creators that innovate and do something. And that is actually true in economics as well. And the more you bring that innovation, the more the city does it. It throws off jobs, it throws off more innovation, and you get a positive growth pattern. And Glaeser's work, Glaeser's a very well-known economist, does a lot of statistical work, has shown over and over again this innovation role for cities. So that's really been the new key in thinking about the importance of cities to the economy, not just for themselves, but for the whole United States. Urban economies, urban areas in the United States, metropolitan areas, produce well over 70, 80% of the country's gross domestic product. We are an urban country and we are an urban economy. There's a couple key points, the strengths and weaknesses of that economic approach. I already talked about innovation. The weakness is that economists tend to think only in terms of individuals making decisions, individuals maximizing in economics words, kind of self-regarding. And there's certainly a lot of that goes on in an economy. That leads economists to distrust policy interventions. They think markets are better than policy. They think policy interventions screw up outcomes a lot of the time. And so you should be very careful about engaging in policy that interferes with what markets do. And that's got a lot of strength to it analytically, but one of the theses of the book, or one of the points of the book, is that it misses a lot by having that framework. Economists have something they call public goods, which is like, why are there schools? Why do we have mass transit? Why do we have other sorts of factors? And have to figure out some way to derive those. Those are fought for historically over time. People battle for those. We didn't used to have health and safety regulations. Now we do. We didn't used to have mandatory public schooling. Now we do. And so one of the weaknesses in the economics account of cities is this idea of what's a public role and what's a private role. There's two types of inequality that are important in the book and for our thinking. And one is inequality within cities. Cities are very unequal. You can just walk around in New York and look at the book. Starts with a view of 420 Park Avenue, one of the super tall skyscrapers, which I like aesthetically. I'm not opposed to that kind of building, but kind of towering over a city has become a symbol in a way of inequality in the city. You have these very high skyscrapers filled with very rich people and everybody else kind of running around down at the street level. And so you've got inequality within cities, that even though cities produce all this wealth and innovation, there's still a lot of inequality. That doesn't seem to go away. And in the standard economics account, eventually that inequality would be reduced. People get new jobs, they get better educations, they pass laws that help them regulate the economy, and that would ease it out. So for economists like Glaeser, the quote says, cities attract poor people, but then they can make their lives better. And we see that around the world. We've seen it in the United States. Cities like New York both got a huge amount of foreign immigration coming in, poor people that work their way up, and also internal migration in the United States. African Americans, particularly from the South in the 1920s, what the so-called Great Migration out of the South, John is one of the country's leading experts on immigration, so I'm not going to belabor that point. But they came to cities, right? They didn't go to some other farmland, and that helped a lot of them improve their lives and get better. But we still have persistent inequality, and it doesn't get competed away. Economists have a measure of inequality called the Gini coefficient. I won't derive it for you. It just says how much inequality you've got. And in 2019, as the slide will tell you, major cities, metropolitan areas in the United States had the same level of measured inequality as countries that we think of as very unequal: Zambia, Costa Rica, Brazil. Our cities have the same level of measured inequality as those countries do, and it has not diminished over time. There's also, so that's inequality within cities. There's also inequality between or among cities. There are richer and poorer cities in the United States. Economists think, well, that'll level out because it's too expensive. You won't just keep paying those high rents in New York or San Francisco. You'll move to Kansas City or someplace, and that eventually cities will converge, that they'll lose these big spikes in inequality, but they haven't. We'll talk about the pandemic a little bit at the end to see if that's changing that, but economists have been waiting for cities to converge for a quarter of a century, and then we don't see it in the data. So that's another puzzle. Why does this persistent inequality go on both within the city and between the cities? Four big factors here, won't belabor them, that I think are left out of economic analysis or the standard account. Big industrial changes, and we'll see that in New York, of course, has gone through several big industrial changes from a port city and a trade city, from a city that had a lot of low-wage manufacturing jobs to one dominated by finance and business services. Big changes, those cause big changes in people's lives, the kind of jobs you have, the kind of infrastructure and other support you have. So that's one. The second, a well-known story for New Yorkers, at least, is that federal government is biased against cities, and we'll return to this, but it pervades a lot of why this inequality persists. The third point is something I think people don't recognize as much, and I want to argue that states also are anti-city historically in the United States, and I think still to this day. And so it's not just the federal government, it's also the state governments themselves tend to be tilted against cities. And then fourth, something that pervades all our economy and certainly pervades cities and inequality is structural racism across labor markets, across housing in particular, housing in the forms of metropolitan areas with suburbs, dominantly, not exclusively, but often white suburbs, wealthier suburbs that won't allow integration or other types of housing, and that persists over time. It's a long-standing bias. There's Thomas Jefferson, some folks are very quotable president, and he said, "I view great cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man." Now, you might think that's a pretty standard from an agrarian slaveholder who didn't like cities, but Jefferson is often thought also as one of the people that formed democracy for us, our ideas about democracy. He was very mistrustful of cities. During when there was a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, Jefferson said, well, at least maybe that will kill off some of the inhabitants. I'm paraphrasing. The means of producing some good. The yellow fever will discourage the growth of great cities in our nation because people will die off and then they won't move there. So he was very biased against cities. And that's built into the Constitution of the United States and our political system. In our electoral college, the way Congress is set up, when the United States separated from Great Britain, we were mostly a rural agricultural nation, not an urban one. And that stayed on. States then, as they developed, also malapportioned themselves against cities. And so we've got this long, consistent anti-urban bias built into our policies. And here's a great illustration for you Manhattanites. So North Dakota and South Dakota, these are slightly old population numbers, but they haven't changed that much. North Dakota has 2 senators and South Dakota has 2 senators. So those two have 4 senators. And then there's the same populations of North Manhattan and South Manhattan. But North Manhattan doesn't have 2 senators and South Manhattan doesn't have 2 other senators. They've got like 1/18 probably of a senator, maybe, with that population. And so that really is a structural bias when you get to the federal level. The Congress is apportioned this way, but particularly institutions like the Senate give states a lot of power and rural states a lot of power against the cities, which are the hubs and the producers of our wealth and economy. After World War II, and the book is largely focuses on this time period for, there's 3 case studies at the center of the book: New York, Los Angeles, and Detroit. Those are all cities that tried very hard to do something about inequality with their own resources and own policies. And I have to say, I think largely we're not able to affect it very much. I was much more optimistic when I started writing the book than when I finished about what cities could do on their own. There are a number of factors there, again, won't review them, but it's the 4th one I really want to call attention to, which is the metropolitan area and the city. Analysts sometimes will use those 2 terms interchangeably. People will talk about New York or Detroit. Sometimes they'll just mean the legal city of New York City or the legal city of Detroit. Sometimes they'll mean the whole region, the New York economic region. For an economist, that's often what you think about: the New York suburbs, the New Jersey suburbs, but really are all part of one regional economy called the New York economy. But politically, they're not organized that way. It's a very important point. You've got one regional economy and literally hundreds of separate governments within that same economy that have power over housing, over transportation, over economic development. And it's that disjunction, I think, that economists don't pay enough attention to, and is a big source of our persistent inequality. And here's a picture of it. That is Detroit, and although it's Detroit is one of the more segregated metros in the United States, but not wildly different. And the dotted line is the city of Detroit, and the yellow dots are households headed by African Americans, and the blue dots are households headed by whites. And you can see the segregation in this regional economy, right? There's no logical reason why it would be, it's almost 80% Black residents on one side of that line of Detroit and 80 or 90% white residents on the other side. That's a historical development of the way we've done housing, that we've let those suburban governments control who gets to live there, what kind of housing they have, what kind of schools they have. And that this form is a pretty persistent form in the United States. So metropolitan areas are economies in a way, but they're not cities. The legal city at the heart of those metropolitan economies is disadvantaged in a lot of ways. What to do? Well, maybe we should go back to city-states. For those of you who are real historians, we had city-states back in the Italian days, Florence, Milan, and others. They were kind of dukedoms in cities that ruled against or fought with each other a lot, but fought with others. And this is this map takes a little explaining, but I like it. So the blue stuff in the map is commuting patterns in the United States. This also shows that there's a lot of empty space in the United States. When you see those maps of the states and so, oh, look, most of the states are Republican, nobody lives there, right? They're big empty spaces. And you see that in the non-shaded in sections on the map with those hubs. Those hubs represent about 95% of the commuting trips in the United States. They don't all go into Minneapolis or Washington or Dallas, but they work in that regional economy. So that the people and the jobs and the economy of the United States really look like that shaded in map with the blue kind of amoeba shapes, not like the usual lines you've seen with the state lines. And so 2 geographers who weren't particularly political said, gee, what if we divided up the country along the lines of where people actually work and what their economic relations are? And they came up with this other map, which is the lower 48 states. And there are about 52, 53 regions there. So we won't do this, but I thought, what if you didn't have all those states having 2 senators, but each one of those regions had 2 senators? We'd have a very different country. We'd have different urban politics. I think we'd have less inequality. And it would also be more aligned with the realities of the American economy. And that big empty space in Montana and part of Wyoming, you could probably just allocate to people there. But we're not going back to city-states. It would be a much more logical way, and it would be a governmental system that overlaid our economy in an appropriate way. So Carol said, I'm going to talk about New York, and the book has, again, 3 case studies: New York, Detroit, and Los Angeles. And in all 3 of those, I try and work through these 4 factors that I think economics leaves out. Industrial change, what happened to those economies and industry? How did federal anti-urban policies affect them? What about state bias against the city? And then how does structural racism play its way through? And so in a way, down the one side, there's pictures of some, very dramatic and important political events where some mayors cared more about fighting inequality than others. David Dinkins until Mayor Adams, the only Black mayor that New York City has had. And the person who beat him, Rudy Giuliani, not someone interested in pushing for inequality. Michael Bloomberg, who saw the city in a global competition with places like London for the financial services industry. And then Bill de Blasio holding up his book showing that how much he tried to fight inequality. And what they're telling you, and I guess part of the thesis of the book, and this would be great to talk to John about, is that I'm sort of a structuralist here. And what do I mean by that? I mean that throughout those very volatile and very important political dynamics, I don't think the story about inequality actually changed that much, that the city's inability to really affect it in terms of its policies was pretty marginal. These other factors are the drivers, and they're often outside of cities' control. That doesn't mean that things that these mayors do aren't important. They're extraordinarily important, and they matter a lot, particularly in terms of housing, race relations, policing, all sorts of other things that cities are responsible for. But for the overall economic trajectory, if you looked at these mayors, they all were pretty focused on keeping a thriving office sector alive once the manufacturing economy began to decline. And I do have to do on the state bias against the city. I talk about New York on this slide, but you could find that everywhere in the country. That in Texas, the so-called Texas Triangle of Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston in the south, San Antonio, and Austin makes up about 75% of the total economy of the state of Texas. It produces 75% of the GDP, but those cities that do not have any political power relative to the overall state. They can't control use of guns. They can't control a lot of what gets taught in the schools. They can't do any environmental work. New York City, which we think was progressive, actually is dependent on the New York State legislature a lot for things that it wants to do. Worker pensions, transportation policy, environmental policy like congestion pricing or banning plastic bags in stores are things that the state legislature has to approve. And I love this quote from George Washington Plunkett of Tammany Hall, the great corrupt political machine of the late 19th century, said that Albany, the state capital of New York, viewed New York City as pie for the hayseeds. I mean, something that the rural people could consume unfairly. I mentioned also in the second bullet, the declining federal aid to cities. The Rockefeller Institute at the State University every year puts out a fiscal report, and New York State sends a lot more money to the federal government, principally New York City sends it, than we get back in aid. New York, Massachusetts, and New Jersey are the three biggest net contributors to the federal government, who get less money back than we send in taxes. The states that get the most back are Kentucky, which is probably an artifact of Mitch McConnell, New Mexico, because that has a lot of federal laboratories, and in poor southern states that don't send much tax revenue in, but get a lot of aid from the federal government. I talk a little bit about in the book about, well, why is there another alternative vision for economics? Is there a progressive economic vision? And one of the contrasts that I draw is between New York and Los Angeles, where I think that New York's progressives do not have a strong positive economic growth theory. They have a redistribution theory, which matters a lot, but ultimately doesn't move the economy along terrifically well. And I hope I learned it correctly, I'll find out from John, that the elections are often fought out over other issues and not so much on the economy. An important moment in that, I think, was the turning down of the Amazon headquarters and the Industry City complex in Brooklyn. I consider myself a progressive, union-oriented supporter, but I think that the city should have fought harder to cut a better deal with Amazon. They might not have been able to, but just to reject it out of hand, or to reject the Industry City development, and John may have different views on this, was a mistake. That progressives need to engage in an economic development strategy, not just a redistribution strategy. That's a picture of the Staples Center in Los Angeles. So in the Los Angeles case, I talk about the use of the growth of a political coalition between unions, but not just unions, also developers, those horrible developers who like to build things, environmentalists who often are seen as we don't want to build anything, and communities of color who want jobs and progress for their residents at the very least. And for some time, Los Angeles has been able to work those three groups together in a triangle and then that supports growth and projects. The Staples Center was one of the first big community, what's called a community benefit agreement in the United States, where members of the community came together, negotiated with the Staples Center's developers and said, we can stop this development, but if you give us what we want, if you'll work with us, we'll help you get it passed. Because there's often a lot of opposition to big development projects in cities. And they did, and that gave rise to a political movement in Los Angeles that still had a lot of strength on using this community benefits agreements. New York has been opposed to community benefits agreements. Mayor Bloomberg hated them. And even Mayor de Blasio, who was an advocate for fighting inequality, was not a strong advocate for them either. I am. Long slide. We'll have the slides will be made available to you. But can we get growth and equality together? Some economists say, look, you can't get both. There's a trade-off between growth and inequality. You have to let growth go and then use tax and redistribution afterwards. But some research says that we could center equality and growth policies together. They could be complements. They could help each other rather than being trade-offs with each other. And so, again, I'm going to claim it. It's in the book. I'd love you, and John and I can talk about it some more. We can circle back to this. There are certain ways that you can do policies in cities, I think, that do have more equitable outcomes and ways that don't. That's not often believed by mainstream economics. I have a quote there from Ed Glazer who says, people, not places, are the important outcomes. You should concentrate your policies on education, on skill development, not try and do place-based development. If a city runs down, that's its problem and needs to, Glazer once said, only half tongue-in-cheek, for all the money that we spent in New Orleans rebuilding Hurricane Katrina, it would have been better just to give a check, a couple $100,000 to every resident of New Orleans and let them move. And that's an extreme view, but one that illustrates this view that in the mainstream, you should concentrate on people, not on places. And let me wrap it up here. So the cities face this inequality problem. Let me see if I can just recap it. The cities are the hubs of innovation and prosperity in the United States. They're going to continue to be that, I think. But they continually also produce inequality that's not self-correcting. And so how are you going to correct that? What kind of policies can you use? How much does the city have under its control? As I said before, less than I had hoped when I started writing the book, but I still think it's important. And now we're seeing new challenges against this framework that I think are important for the future. Working from home, I'm blocking a picture of somebody typing into their computer with like a 5-year-old on their lap trying to work at home. And that matters to cities because insofar as jobs relocate to homes outside of the boundary, remember again, that regional economy, people can still be working for companies in the region, but if they aren't living in New York City, then they're going to pay less taxes. There'll also be less jobs for city residents in restaurants, services, building services, janitorial, security services that service those office buildings. And those workers tend to be lower income and people of color more. So that if jobs really do relocate a lot to homes and stay there, it's a big challenge for the city in the most immediate case in terms of its tax revenue, but also in terms of the shape and function, the way it works. Second, housing. There's a picture of people calling Bill de Blasio a terrible housing developer, a curse, to be a developer. We all live in houses that were built by developers, but there's a lot of blocking of housing development in cities, even by progressives and people on the left. Something, again, that I think is a mistake to do. That should be more housing development. And can we get a politics that will allow more housing construction, particularly affordable housing, but I actually think all kinds of housing helps with affordability. And the third big point that has been hurting cities a lot since the Trump administration and then the pandemic on top of it has been a decline in immigration into the city. New York in particular has always been John has written about this extensively, always been a place that brings in immigrants. And that's been one of the things that's been the lifeblood of the city's progress. If you compare it to Detroit, Detroit had a lot of immigrants in the early 20th century for industrial work, but since then, very little. And it really hurt them as a city. Los Angeles, of course, is another major hub of immigration. So we need immigration to come back in for New York, I think, and for other cities to prosper. And that's a combination of both economic forces and public policy. And maybe that would help offset if we do have this working from home movement out into the suburbs, and it stays a little more permanent, whether immigrants can help offset it as they have helped in the past with New York City. So that's the story that economists get some things right, innovation, they get a lot of things wrong, particularly the inattention to politics and the fracturing, the fragmentation of the regional economy into all these hundreds of governments that often fight with each other. And that cities have some buttons they can push to move to fight inequality, but ultimately are really constrained from solving the problem themselves. They can't solve it on their own. That's a kind of a downbeat ending. There are things they can do, but it's going to take a national politics that pays more attention to inequality for us to really address these problems.
Hello. So, as you concluded your talk, you said it was a very downbeat message, and I want to explore that in two ways. First, you said there were some things that cities could do, but there would have to be changes at a broader level, perhaps a federal level, and certainly we have past experiences with the New Deal and the Great Society that had very large impacts on cities and how they developed and who got what. So, and you've spent a lot of time in Washington, and both on the legislative side and the administrative side, and know it far better than on these issues, far better than just about anyone else I know. So I'd like to know from you what you think those measures should be and what it would take politically to bring them about. But secondly, I'd like to push on you a little bit about this question of cities being locked in an iron cage of competition with their suburbs and with each other, and being exploited as sources of wealth for suburbanites, but not sufficient tax revenue to help the people inside the cities who are suffering from inequality generating dynamics. And I would just note that New York City has a current budget of $104 billion, something like that. That's the third largest budget behind the state of California and the state of New York. And it's about a third, roughly, of the entire European Union budget. It's a budget that's much bigger than many countries. And a lot of it is raised from own sources. Even the money that goes to Albany and back for education is money that we're contributing to Albany. So there's a pretty substantial fiscal capacity to fund public programs in New York City. And we have a pretty big, elaborated, and in many ways, fairly effective welfare state in the city. So I would offer that as a little bit of a counterexample to the general idea that cities are just being sucked dry and don't have the resources to address their problems. So on those two fronts, I wonder what your reactions are.
On the first, there's going to have to be an alliance from cities and these suburbs that I spent time criticizing, because the cities themselves, the way they're constructed politically, don't have enough political power to affect the federal government. And I think that probably has to be in the form of actually taking their states over. Someone, if you look at a place like California and to some extent New York more recently, but not that some ability to affect the state legislature and do things on policy can help in that way. California used to be, as you know, a Republican state, and now it's solidly blue up and down, and it's really their cities that run a lot of that.
Well, that right. Would seem to be a little bit of a counter argument to your overall argument. I mean, the governor of California is from San Francisco. The speakers of the legislature have been from Los Angeles. The city part of the state delegations in California has, outsized weight in the majorities in the state legislature. And if you look at the New York State legislature, the leaders come from in New York or right next to New York. And the New York City Democratic vote is close to half the state Democratic primary vote. And the Democrats hold supermajorities in both the houses. So this picture of the cities being incapable of developing strategies to maybe they don't get completely proportionate share of the wealth that they're generating and recirculating through the tax system, but they get a pretty significant share.
Well, that brings us to the second point, because I think that we're all now talking about government spending and government policy, which is very important for financing the welfare state, et cetera. That is not, in my view, we're not going to stop inequality in that way. We've got to engage the economy and the labor market itself to really address inequality. It's not just a matter of getting enough control of the state budget and then redistributing tax revenue or taxing rich people more. Those are important things.
Okay,
to
so
do.
let's hear a little bit more about what kind of legislation would you like to see passed that would move the ball?
Well, and I think your argument would do well, is a good one. If you look at the increase in the minimum wage, for example, we can't move it federally. There's a lot of blockage, but over half of the labor force in the country now has a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage, and that's driven by cities. Some states and some cities have raised that wage. So that's one good thing that would do that changes the terms of the labor agreement. I'm a big person that believes in labor unions and some form of worker representation. That's quite hard to do at the state level because of the way federal labor law is written. And the ability of states to, so we look at some positive states, right? And that is good. That's one of the complications with federalism, again, something you're extremely well versed in. We also have a lot of really bad regressive states that do bad things, that box in their cities and won't let them do things. And Missouri, which is now more of a red state than it used to be, there's two major cities, Kansas City and St. Louis. Both of those cities passed an increase in their minimum wage, and the state legislature not only took away those minimum wage increases, they passed a law saying cities cannot raise the minimum wage. It's up to the state to do it. States control cities. Back in, as you know, in the 19th century, there was this kind of struggle over, could cities act independently or could state governments control what they did? And that has come down in the way that states control them. So that the route then is to try and take over your state if you can, or find alliances in that way. But it's really this being able to change the terms of how the labor market works and how the economy works is extremely hard for states, even individual states, to do. They can do a lot of redistribution, and those are good, valuable things. But I don't think that they can affect these more fundamental. I'm an economist, right? So I'm going to call fundamental, but these economic factors are really much harder to influence.
Okay, I agree with you that the overall patterns of economic inequality, what share of the earnings and wealth go to the top 1% or 10% versus the top 50% or the bottom 30% or the bottom 10% are governed by large features of the political economy that cities, generally speaking, can't alter. But I do think cities have more autonomy than your argument might give them credit for, to shape, if not the basic patterns, then to address inequities in who's getting access to upward mobility opportunities. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the 19th century, you mentioned Tammany Hall. The Irish strategy of governance was to control contracts being let by the city, to influence development patterns, to developers who, yes, gave money to Tammany Hall, but Tammany Hall could also say, well, hire our Irish friends who need work. And the Irish upward mobility in New York City was partly a function of their economic prowess. Mm-hmm. I mean, their political prowess. Yeah. And there are other groups that have used politics as a path to upward mobility in city government. So I would maybe distinguish between some city political cultures or political dynamics where marginal groups have no chance to get anywhere, and an older economic elite kind of keeps the lid on everyone, versus cities where there have been progressive coalitions that have provided upward mobility for at least some people who were previously locked out of opportunity. And that may not change the overall structure of the income distribution, but I think it could change the subjective feelings of worthiness, of success, of being respected, of achieving valued positions in society. And that even if we're not, changing the structure of capitalist political economy, that kind of politics can accomplish some important and valid and useful things. And a big economic structural analysis might tend to overlook that a bit.
Yes, and so one of my three cases is Los Angeles, which I think actually fits this model pretty well, that in reaction to a big industrial change, the loss of the aerospace and other high-paying jobs, coincidental about the same time as the infamous case where a motorist, Rodney King, was captured and beaten by the police, which led to violence and a lot of deaths and basically a military occupation of part of the city. Out of that came, again, as you know, this political movement that tried to bring together not just communities of color, both Black and Hispanic, but also work with labor unions and work with environmentalists who historically have been seen as people that block growth and development. Right? I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but that then led to a political movement that then got a mayor elected, got city councils elected, and I think did do a lot of progressive things in Los Angeles. They're the ones that pioneered these community benefit agreements. So that's a tool that I think cities should be using more. I wish that New York progressives were more focused on these economic aspects of policy than they are.
I disagree with you there a little bit, because you mentioned Bill de Blasio's not being a fan of community benefits agreements, but the Atlantic Terminal Urban Renewal Area project that resulted in the Barclays Center, which could be considered our equivalent of the Staples Center, had a very ironclad community benefits agreement that spoke to who was getting the jobs in Barclays. And if you go there are a lot of Brooklyn restaurants that have franchises there. The people working on the staff of Barclays are staffing the franchisees. They're mostly community people. And I think that the jobs benefit of Barclays and the overall Atlantic Terminal project has been pretty substantial. And de Blasio played a key role in making that happen.
Yeah, fair point. But that's one, and we can find lots of bad ones in New York City. New York City also has some terrible, the Knightsbridge ice hockey piece, the Yankee Stadium CBA, which is pre-de Blasio, I recognize, which were sham deals that didn't make a deal. It doesn't seem to be something that's consistent. And I think walking away from the Amazon deal. Now, again, Amazon may have never been willing to negotiate enough of a deal with the community, but to walk away from that deal, or the industry city part in Brooklyn, which I know you and I disagreed about before, I think there's so I'll give you Atlantic guys, but I'll put Amazon and Industry City back on it, that there hasn't been a consistent movement to do it that way that's really gone into the politics of it in the way that I think has in Los Angeles.
For a year, I was the director of the Economic Development Division of the New York City Department of City Planning that was reviewing a lot of projects that were percolating. And Mark Willis, who's in the audience today, was my partner in that effort. And along the way, talking to the old hands inside the department, there was a move afoot to rezone the west side of Times Square to promote development, and a lot of other things cooking at that time. And one of the wise old heads in city planning said that there was always a 30-year arc of development in New York City, and there would be 2 or 3 plans along the way. And the fact that the first or second or even third plan got shot down was not going to deter a plan from developing successfully over time. And then, in fact, what ultimately happened would probably be better because there had been conflict over these earlier plans. And now, we look at Times Square and we marvel at what it is economically. I worked in Times Square for quite a few years, and in Bryant Park, there was a lot of drugs being dealt and people were being shot across the street from my workplace. You go there now and it's a sort of a Disney World of what urban development should be. So I think about New York City, there are a lot of hungry mouths that want to be fed around every deal. And it takes a while, to work it all out among them. And there are a lot of people who could be veto players are going to veto until they get what they want out of it. And so just because Amazon didn't get what it wanted, and the developers at Industry City didn't get what they wanted, doesn't mean that something very like what they were shooting for won't ultimately happen. And that's what politics in New York City is all about. Yes, maybe they could have settled for a deal that didn't quite satisfy some parties, but by saying no, you show that you have to do something better next time around. And the fact that as much affordable housing is built around developments in New York City, that's a product of a long political struggle from a period when, at the beginning of Mayor Bloomberg's administration, he was quite opposed to putting any affordable housing constraints on development at all. And over time, we've worked our way to a situation where there's a fairly substantial side benefit of affordable housing development around new development.
Yeah, so one of the things that the book is about, you and I actually agree generally that development is a political process, and that inherently that there's politics in development and it has to be dealt with. So one of the themes of the book is that mainstream economics tends to deny that. Or says it's a bad thing. That somehow we could just get all these claimants out, all these people out, and just let the market do things, it would produce. That's not a realistic picture of urban development now or ever, actually.
Well, I would say that economics is a very important discipline and a very important sphere or plane of life that's all concerned about efficiency and productivity. And politics is an equally important plane of life, and it's all about distribution and who gets what. And economists could say, well, we wish there was no politics all they want, but that's not going to make politics go away. And public policy people in politics, in the political world, might say, well, we don't really care about efficiency. We want distributional equity. And that leaves them with no growth. So you need, I think your book points this out very nicely. We sort of need both, and the economic perspective leaves out the question of distribution to its detriment in terms of understanding how things really work or how we can make things better.
Yeah, and I need to put up a flag for that, and that's why I keep saying mainstream economics. There are other economic perspectives that think about the economy as a political economy, where issues of power and inequality are central to thinking about it, and they aren't just phenomena that are curable with distribution after the market has worked its magic. The system itself. I work at the New School, and so there's different views of the economy that trying to bring that analytic perspective in. So some of the effort in the book is to try and do that, is to open up the dialogue within economics, away from just this, what you described very well as this, but only one way to think about the economy without ceding too much of that to this particular view of the economy. And think about an economics that is a political economy that takes questions of distribution, power, and outcomes as central to it. There are colleagues and friends of ours, Manuel Pastor and Chris Benner, have done work where they say, where their studies show that efforts to include equity actually lead to faster growth, to better growth, that it's not always a trade-off as the standard economic model would have you say. There's OECD research in Europe says the same thing, that government fragmentation leads to lower productivity, not higher productivity. So that one of the things that the book is seeking to engage in is to find an economics that shares these questions about outcomes and fair outcomes and distributional outcomes, and doesn't just relegate those to a post production world where you then distribute stuff. I think that actually that's a model that you can't catch up.
One thing I have my issues with Ed Glaeser frequently, but one thing I do agree with him about is that education and improving overall educational attainment is a key to productivity, and that cities concentrate expertise, and that produces innovation and creates a virtuous circle of sorts. More educated people, more innovation, more growth, more to share around with everyone. And so I think inequality to educational attainment, inequality to upward mobility through educational systems, which is reinforced by all the fragmentation that you point out in our book, is a central issue that both you and he would probably say is a key problem to be improved, or if we could lift the educational attainment of the bottom half of the educational distribution, that would be something that would massively help the problems that you described. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about in the educational field how we would go about that, and are there cities, metropolitan regions, states that are doing a much better job at that than others in your experience? And I'd also, before we end, you're one of the few people that I know that really know a lot about Detroit. I've read a lot about it, but I only visited once as a child to go to the Henry Ford Museum, and our image of Detroit now is as a sort of a destroyed city, but it's coming back in some ways, and sort of what do you think about Detroit's prospects? It would seem like the basket case in your comparison, but is it truly hopeless, or what's going on there, if anything, that you would see as positive?
So on the education thing first, right? I think I agree that education is necessary, but it's not sufficient. I think Glaeser and other economists would argue that basically education by itself is going to be the thing that drives it. And if you could get that right, more educated people will work itself out in the market, and you don't need other interventions. He's quite and the way he would fix schools in New York City would be to get rid of the teachers union and get rid of organized labor people, and that's something I don't agree with. You described very well one of the real damaging things that this metropolitan form of all these isolated suburbs has given us is extremely unequal education. Education is paid for mostly by property taxes in the United States, and these wealthier suburbs, often very segregated, don't have to. They benefit from being part of this metropolitan economy, but they don't have to pay the costs of it, and they don't have to pay the cost of the inadequate education and the discriminatory education. That was actually a case in Detroit, as you know, Milliken versus Bradley. The courts in the 1970s said you could bus. A district court in the federal court said you can take kids from the city of Detroit and send them to suburban schools because there's systemic denial of their right to an education that was established in Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. And the Supreme Court 5-4 said, no, you can't do that. You can't send them out of the city of Detroit into these suburbs to get education. And that has forced cities then to take on the education burden themselves, as opposed to being a regional metropolitan one. So a long way around the barn to say this suburban form is really damaging to our ability to get better and more equal education, particularly for those people who need it the most. So I'm in Detroit with that example. I'll stay with Detroit. Detroit is kind of what happens when things really go wrong. In the 1950s, with when the auto industry, Detroit, African Americans in Detroit had the second highest per capita incomes for Blacks in the United States altogether. They were still at the bottom of the ladder within the labor union jobs. They had the worst, most dangerous, and lower paid jobs within unionized auto plants, but they were in unionized auto plants, and that really pulled up their incomes and their well-being. And Detroit really fractured along racial lines. Remember that map I showed you? It's you cross that boundary, and on one side of a major boulevard is 75–80% Black households. Across the street, across the boulevard is 75–80% whites, with different school systems, different transportation systems. There's no reason for that except for the racial division, right? You won't find that kind within a city. You wouldn't find within the same boundary. You wouldn't find that. So that really poisoned Detroit's relationship, metropolitan ability to do anything in the region for decades. Detroit had its own bus system, and the suburbs had a bus system, and it took 35 times in the state legislature before they would even coordinate the bus schedules with each other. It was really quite poison. And then you can see, who do you want to blame on it there? Holman Young, the very Black nationalist mayor of Detroit, got a lot of negative views of people, was very outspoken about civil rights and about Black empowerment. He also balanced the budget in Detroit. He balanced the budget by laying off workers, but it was still, people said, oh, he's the one who destroyed it. Oh, he was not an easy guy for suburbanites to get along with, that they didn't try. So I don't know that Detroit's come back. Detroit was 2.5 million people at its peak over a huge geographic space. It is now under 700,000, and how without really, you can fit San Francisco, Manhattan, and Boston in the boundaries of the physical boundary of Detroit. So until you can consolidate all that, I don't know that there's really a comeback. There are a few pockets downtown. I think we only have a few minutes left.
So I would just like to finish off by, I don't have as downbeat as analysis as you do in the book. And I'm always interested in hearing thoughts about how to use the leverage that's there, however constrained it is, to do some positive things. And so you've mentioned community development, benefit agreements. You've mentioned the importance of labor unions. Are there a few other things that you'd like to close with that, you know, we'd leave our audience and those who will watch later with ideas that you'd like to see pursued?
Yeah. Build a lot more housing, include as much affordable housing as you can in it, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You've got to leverage private markets to get benefits for it. And I think you can generate jobs, as your example of Atlantic Yards, a lot of Los Angeles examples. You can get jobs for people who need them by building more, and building supply ultimately, I believe, will in fact help lower rents, not make them worse. So I'd like to see a lot more housing construction in since we're on New York. That would be one. I think the pre-K, the very expensive thing that de Blasio did to get but universal pre-K was a great move, and more cities should copy that. Labor market regulation, New York is actually pretty strong on some of that, but we're seeing new kind of jobs that need to be cleaned up, particularly for immigrants and undocumented immigrants around delivery systems and other things, but that would be a part of it. And then a better streaming on education through community colleges and all the way up into the workforce and job placement work. We have fragmented workforce development systems, and I'd like to see those brought together more tightly and tied with a much more of an industry specific focus.
Great.
So those are all positive things.
All right.
And I think things the city can do.
Let's go out and get to work.
That's right. Thanks.
And let me just say, as a disembodied voice here on the Zoom, thank you so much. You were on point and on time. It's just 7 o'clock. So you have enriched our hour very much. And thanks both Rick McGahey and John Mollenkopf for this great discussion after.
Thanks for the pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for letting us have us, and thanks to John. It's always a pleasure to hear from him, to engage.
Thanks, everybody. Join us next time.
Bye. Thanks everyone for coming.